3 seasons, that was the number whispered behind fans and gloved hands whenever Eleanor Hartley entered a ballroom, though no one ever said it to her face. 3 seasons of candlelight sliding over silk gowns that were not hers, of orchestras striking up dances she would not join, of a small ivory card looped to her wrist that stayed, every single night, entirely blank. She had learned to stand very still against the papered wall of every great house in London, spine straight, chin level, as though the emptiness of that card were a decision she herself had made. She had a trick for surviving it. She would open her mother's fan, ivory sticks, violets painted faint and silver-veined across the leaf, one rib cracked and mended with thread, and fan herself slowly, as though the heat of the room, and not the stairs, were what troubled her. Louisa, her cousin, called it affectation. Aunt Beatrice called it a habit unbecoming a woman past marrying age. Eleanor called it nothing at all, because naming it would mean admitting how much a folded card and an unopened dance could still, after 3 years, cost her. What none of them noticed, what she herself had almost stopped noticing, was the man who never asked her to dance either, and never asked anyone. Season after season, he stood near the doors in dark, unornamented black, watching the wall more than the floor, watching her more than the wall. He never crossed toward her, he never sent his name. London had long since decided the Duke of Rothmere simply did not dance, and left it at that, the way London left most things it could not explain. Tonight would be no different from the 50-odd nights before it. The same wall, the same silence, the same card curling blank at her wrist, except that, before the candles guttered low, a duke would walk the entire length of a crowded ballroom, past every family who had ever looked past her, and stop in front of Eleanor Hartley alone. But to understand why he waited 3 years to take those 40 steps, you must first understand what those 3 years took from her. One slighted evening, one straightened spine, one small mercy at a time. Eleanor Hartley arrived in London in the spring of her 18th year with 2 trunks, a borrowed maid, and a hope she was careful not to name aloud, even to herself. Her father was a country parson in Hampshire, a gentle man of empty pockets and full bookshelves, and it was her mother's sister, Aunt Beatrice Price, who had offered, insisted really, in the brisk way that made refusal impossible, to bring her out alongside her own daughter, Louisa. Beatrice's townhouse smelled of beeswax and ambition. Louisa's wardrobe took up 2 rooms, Eleanor's took up half of 1 trunk, and she had altered 3 of the 5 gowns herself, letting down hems by candlelight after the household slept, careful with a needle the way she had always been careful with everything she could not afford to waste. She told herself it did not matter. A season was not a promise. It was, her father had written before she left, only an opportunity to be seen by people worth knowing, and being seen, he reminded her gently, cost nothing at all. She believed him, that first week. She had not yet learned how much being unseen could cost instead. Her first ball was at Marchmont House, a crush of 500 candles and twice as many voices, and Eleanor stood at the edge of it clutching a dance card so new the ribbon still smelled of the stationer's shop. She had practiced the quadrille every evening for a month in her father's study, counting steps against the ticking of the mantel clock, certain that competence, at least, she could offer. No one asked to see it. Gentlemen bowed to Louisa, to the Ashford sisters, to a plain-faced heiress with £40,000 and a laugh like breaking glass, and passed Eleanor's corner of the room the way one passes a closed door, without quite looking at it. By midnight her card was as blank as when she had tied it on. She danced twice, once with her uncle out of duty, and once with a boy of 15 dared into it by his sisters, who apologized to her twice during a single turn of the room. She smiled through both. She had already decided, somewhere between the second dance and the ride home in Beatrice's carriage, that smiling was a kind of armor, and that she would wear it however long the fitting required. It was near the doors that she saw him, half in shadow beyond the candlelight's reach, and something in her chest went very still. Tall, dark-haired, unsmiling in a room built for smiling, she knew that face. She was almost certain she knew it, though she had seen it last streaked with mud and pain on a rutted Hampshire lane, not framed by a duke's cravat. "That is Rothmere," Louisa murmured at her elbow, delighted to have noticed her staring. "He never dances. Papa says he barely speaks. You needn't trouble yourself imagining he'll notice you, Eleanor. He doesn't notice anyone." Eleanor said nothing. She was busy convincing herself it could not be the same man, that a duke did not fall from his horse on a public road and let a parson's daughter bind his ankle with strips of her own petticoat, did not thank her by a name he never gave in return. And yet he was watching her now the way that stranger had watched her once, steadily, as though memorizing something he did not intend to lose again. She looked away first. She always would, that season, though it cost her something each time to do it. She wrote to her father that night by a single candle and told him everything about Marchmont House except the one thing that mattered, that the Duke of Rothmere had watched her for the better part of an hour and never once crossed the room to confirm what she suspected, that they had already met. She told herself this was proof enough that she was wrong, that memory had simply dressed a stranger in old mud and older hope. Dukes did not vanish onto country roads. Dukes did not sit in farmhouse kitchens eating bread with cracked, unadorned hands, thanking a girl for petticoat bandages as though she'd given him something finer than any physician could. And yet, folding the letter, she found she had drawn, without meaning to, a small sketch of a fan in the margin, violets, one cracked rib, and beside it, in handwriting she barely recognized as her own, a single unanswered question: had he known her at all, or only her face? She blew out the candle before she could examine why the answer mattered as much as it did. Some doors, she was learning, could stay closed a great while before a woman found the courage to knock. It had happened the autumn before her first season, on the lane between the parsonage and the mill, where Eleanor walked most mornings with a basket of bread for old Mrs. Yardley's family. She found the horse first, a magnificent bay, riderless, grazing the hedgerow with its reins trailing in the mud, and then, 20 paces further, the rider, face down in a ditch swollen with the night's rain. She did not scream. She had nursed her mother through a long illness at 14 and learned, in that terrible practical way grief teaches, that screaming solved nothing a steady hand could not do better. She rolled him onto his back, found him breathing, found the gash above his temple and the ankle already swelling grotesque beneath his boot, and did the only thing she could think to do. She tore the hem from her second-best petticoat, bound the wound as tightly as her small hands allowed, and half-dragged, half-coaxed him the quarter-mile to her father's kitchen, talking to him the entire way about nothing at all, because his eyes kept sliding shut, and she was afraid, more than she let herself admit, of what it would mean if they did not open again. He woke by the fire 2 hours later to find a girl in an apron sponging his temple with vinegar water, utterly unimpressed by him, and it was, he would think many times in the years that followed, the first honest conversation he had ever had with anyone. He gave his name as Vane, true enough, as far as it went, since Vane was his family's name before it was his title, and something in him wanted, badly and for the first time, to be only that. She did not press for more. She fed him bread and cold mutton and a great deal of her father's weak tea, scolded him for trying to stand on the ankle too soon, and spoke to him the entire evening as though he were simply a man who had fallen off a horse, because as far as she knew, that was exactly what he was. He found himself telling her things he told no one, that he was tired in a way sleep did not fix, that he had inherited a title and a debt in the same season, and could not yet tell which weighed more. She only said that debts, at least, could be paid. Titles, she added, smiling for the first time, a man was rather stuck with. He stayed only that night and the better part of the next day, feverish through the dark hours in a way that frightened her more than she showed her father. She sat up with him past 2 in the morning, cooling his brow with a folded cloth, and, when the room grew close, with her mother's old ivory fan, violets painted across the leaf by a hand long dead, kept wrapped in flannel at the bottom of her sewing basket for occasions grander than a stranger's sickbed. She did not know, snapping it shut too fast when her father called her downstairs, that she had cracked one delicate rib clean through. She only knew, mending it by candlelight afterward with thread too coarse for the work, that she minded the small imperfection less than she expected to. By noon the fever broke. By evening a groom arrived from a farm 3 miles off, sent, the man said, from Rothmere Hall, to collect a gentleman thrown from his horse. Her guest, Mr. Vane, she still called him, even watching him swing carefully onto a borrowed mount, thanked her father with a purse her father tried twice to refuse, and thanked her with nothing but a long look she would spend 3 years failing to translate. She did not learn his true name for another 4 months, and then only by accident, reading it in a county newspaper her father left folded on the breakfast table, His Grace the Duke of Rothmere, recently returned to his estates following the death of his father, beside an engraving that made her set down her tea rather too quickly. She told no one. What was there to tell? That a duke had eaten mutton in her father's kitchen and called her sensible in a tone that made the word sound like the finest compliment he owned? That she had mended her mother's fan by candlelight and thought of him each time she opened it since, more than she thought a girl with no dowry and no particular beauty had any right to think of a duke at all? When Aunt Beatrice's letter arrived in the spring, inviting her to London for a season, Eleanor packed the fan without quite admitting to herself why, folded between her second-best gloves, as though some small part of her had already guessed the two of them were bound, sooner or later, to occupy the same crowded room. She could not have guessed how many rooms, nor how long the waiting between them would stretch. The rest of that first season arranged itself into a pattern Eleanor came to know by heart: arrival, always a little early, because Beatrice insisted early arrival showed proper eagerness for a niece who could not be choosy; the receiving line, where hostesses said her name and forgot it in the same breath; the long stretch of standing, she learned to angle her body so the wall bore some of her weight without appearing to lean, a small vanity she allowed herself; the dances she watched rather than danced, counting the figures under her breath out of old habit, as though competence unused might still, someday, be called upon. And always, near the end of the evening, the particular ache of removing an unmarked card from her wrist in the carriage home, the ribbon slightly damp from her own nervous hands. She never let Louisa see her cry over it, and she rarely cried at all, having decided early that tears were a luxury requiring an audience sympathetic enough to justify them, and she had none. She had, instead, her spine, which she kept straight through every slight the way her father kept his faith through every empty collection plate, not because it changed the outcome, but because some things were worth doing correctly regardless of outcome. Louisa was not unkind by nature, Eleanor told herself often, only unkind by convenience, the way a fire does not hate the room it warms merely because it happens also to scorch whatever stands too close. "You mustn't take it to heart," Louisa said one evening, tying a fresh ribbon into her own overflowing card while Eleanor's lay empty on the dressing table between them. "Gentlemen simply prefer a girl who's easy to talk to. You always look as though you're grading their conversation." Aunt Beatrice, overhearing, did not disagree. She had brought Eleanor out of genuine family duty and a genuine hope of eventually being relieved of the expense, and when neither materialized quickly, her patience thinned to a civility so correct it stung worse than open cruelty would have. "Perhaps less reading," she suggested once, not unkindly, "and more listening to be read to. Gentlemen like to feel clever, Eleanor, and a girl who already knows the answer rarely lets them feel it." Eleanor absorbed this the way she absorbed most family wisdom that season, quietly, without argument, and without the smallest intention of changing, because the one thing 3 years of walls had not yet taught her to surrender was the shape of her own mind. It was at Lady Farrington's ball, midway through that first season, that Eleanor first noticed something she could not explain. Her usual corner, a drafty stretch of wall between a potted fern and a window that never quite shut, had been replaced, without her asking, by a small gilt chair drawn close to the hearth, angled so she could watch the dancing in comfort, while the cold September evening battered the glass elsewhere in the room. She assumed a footman's error until she tried to move, politely, back to her accustomed spot, and was told, with faint confusion, that the chair had been specifically arranged for the young lady in grey, on instruction, on whose instruction the footman could not or would not say. She looked instinctively toward the doors, where a tall figure in unornamented black stood half in shadow, watching the floor with an expression that gave away nothing at all, and told herself, firmly, that it meant nothing, that great houses simply moved furniture for reasons known only to housekeepers, and that she was, perhaps, developing an unhealthy habit of finding a duke's hand in every small mercy London happened to offer her that year. The second mercy arrived a fortnight later at Beatrice's townhouse, a small hothouse posy of violets, delivered with the morning's flowers, and no card of any kind, addressed only to Miss E. Hartley, in a hand so plain and unadorned, it might have belonged to a steward rather than a suitor. Beatrice assumed a mistake and nearly discarded them. Eleanor kept them, pressed between the pages of her mother's prayer book, without ever quite admitting to herself what she suspected, because to admit it meant admitting how absurd the suspicion was, that a duke who had never once approached her, never once claimed acquaintance across a crowded ballroom, might nonetheless be arranging small comforts around the edges of her difficult evenings, like a man tending a fire he was not permitted to sit beside. She told no one. She pressed the violets flat, and later, alone, held them beside the painted violets on her mother's fan, and found the two nearly identical in shade, and told herself that proved nothing whatsoever, even as some quieter, more hopeful part of her began, against every sensible instinct she owned, to wait. He had recognized her the instant she entered Marchmont House, before Louisa ever spoke her name, before the candlelight fully found her face, recognized the set of her shoulders first, the particular way she held stillness like a skill rather than a deficiency, and felt something in his careful, deliberately guarded chest come loose for the first time since his father's funeral. Julian Vane, Duke of Rothmere, had spent 11 months telling himself the girl from the Hampshire road was a memory he would eventually outgrow, the way a fever leaves a man weakened but eventually well. He had not outgrown her. He had, if anything, catalogued her more precisely in her absence than he ever managed while sitting in her father's kitchen. The exact gray of her eyes, the chip in her fan's ivory rib, the way she'd told him debts could be paid and titles a man was simply stuck with, as though both were equally survivable. He crossed no room that first night. He told himself it was prudence. He watched her instead from the doorway, the way a man watches weather he cannot yet afford to walk out into, and went home to a house full of lawyers and a contract he had not yet found the courage to break. The contract had been his father's last transaction, negotiated from a sickbed with the same cold competence the old duke had brought to every bargain of his life. Rothmere's finances, it emerged after the funeral, were considerably less sound than the title suggested, encumbered by loans taken against 3 bad harvests and a shipping venture that had foundered somewhere off the coast of Portugal. Lord Fenwick held the largest of those debts, and Lord Fenwick had a daughter, Cordelia, and a solution requiring no further negotiation once both fathers signed it. The debt forgiven, the estate secured, in exchange for a wedding between the new Duke and Miss Fenwick within 3 years of the old Duke's death. Julian had been given no voice in the matter, only a signature already witnessed, and a mother whose health and household depended on his honoring it. He had agreed in the numb weeks after the funeral, before he had ever met a girl in a ditch, before he understood that a contract signed for other people's survival could still cost a man everything he might otherwise have wanted for his own. By the time he understood that fully, the papers were already old, and unwinding them, his solicitors warned him gravely, would take considerably longer than signing them ever had. He could not court her. That was the plain, unmovable center of it. A duke publicly bound to one woman could not pay open attention to another without destroying the very reputation he most wanted to protect. And Eleanor Hartley, penniless and unconnected, would survive a scandal of his making a great deal worse than he would. So he did the only things a bound man could do without breaking his word entirely. He arranged, through a housekeeper who owed him a discreet favor, that the coldest corner of certain ballrooms find itself unexpectedly furnished before Eleanor arrived. He learned, through his steward, that Reverend Hartley's parish roof had failed after a hard winter storm, and paid for its repair through an intermediary so thoroughly obscured that even his own solicitor believed the funds came from a diocesan charity. He sent violets once, unsigned, because he had noticed the ones painted on her fan, and could not, in the end, resist the small foolish comfort of matching them. He told himself each gesture was harmless, a private kindness costing him nothing but a little gold and considerably more restraint than he knew he possessed. He did not yet understand that restraint, indulged too long, has a way of curdling into something closer to grief. It was watching her fold that unmarked dance card into her glove at the end of Lady Farrington's ball, watching her do it without a single flinch, as though blank cards were simply a category of weather one dressed for, that Julian finally wrote to his solicitor requesting, in terms considerably sharper than his usual correspondence, every possible avenue by which the Fenwick contract might be dissolved without ruining his mother, his estates, or Lord Fenwick's considerable pride. The answer, when it came, was not encouraging. Such arrangements, his solicitor wrote, were rarely undone quickly, and never undone quietly. It would require finding Lord Fenwick an alternative satisfaction for the debt, likely another buyer for the mortgaged land, and negotiations of that delicacy could not be hurried without arousing exactly the scandal Julian most needed to avoid. Weeks, the letter warned, possibly seasons. Julian read it twice, standing at his study window with a view of a city containing, somewhere within its 1,000 candlelit rooms, a woman he had no right yet to claim, and made a decision he did not share with his solicitor, his mother, or anyone else. However long it took, he would not let her spend those seasons believing no one had ever truly seen her. Season 1 ended, as all seasons did, with a final ball and a long carriage journey home to Hampshire, where the parsonage's particular quiet felt, that first week, almost loud after months of orchestras. Her father asked few questions and she volunteered fewer answers, though she told him, truthfully, that she had made a friend or two, had learned the newest dances even if she'd rarely been asked to perform them, and had not, in any material way, disgraced the family name. He seemed satisfied with this, being a man who measured most things by whether disaster had been avoided rather than whether triumph had been achieved. She did not tell him about the chair by the fire, or the violets, or the fan she now opened more carefully than she used to, mindful of its mended rib. She spent the recess helping in the parish, reading in the garden, and, more often than she admitted even to herself, glancing toward the lane where a lost rider had once fallen from his horse, half expecting, with no reasonable grounds whatsoever, that lightning might strike twice in the same quiet corner of Hampshire. It did not. She returned to London for a second season in the spring, hope worn thinner but, stubbornly, not yet gone. Season 2 arrived with a piece of news that rearranged the entire household's temperature. Louisa was engaged, respectably and rather triumphantly, to a baronet's heir with 4,000 a year and an excellent set of teeth, and the wedding would take place that autumn, leaving Eleanor, Beatrice observed more than once, the only girl left needing settling. The word settling had begun by then to feel less like a verb and more like a diagnosis. Louisa, giddy with her own success, grew if anything gentler in her cruelty, which somehow stung worse than the sharper kind had, patting Eleanor's hand at parties, introducing her as my dear cousin, so clever, so particular, in a tone that made particular sound like a euphemism everyone present understood. At Lady Ashworth's ball that April, a young man Eleanor rather liked, a vicar's second son with kind eyes and clumsy feet, asked Louisa to dance instead of her, apologizing afterward that he hadn't liked to presume, as though asking Eleanor required a boldness asking anyone else did not. She smiled, as always. She had grown, by then, remarkably skilled at smiling through observations that would once have undone her entirely, and she told herself skill was its own kind of victory, even when no one applauded it. It was Beatrice who first said the widower's name aloud, over breakfast in early May, in the brisk tone she reserved for unpleasant necessities. Sir Reginald Pruitt, recently widowed a second time, possessed a comfortable income, a house in Kent, 3 children requiring a mother, and, Beatrice noted, as though listing an advantage, very modest expectations regarding beauty or fortune in whatever woman agreed to provide one. He has asked after you twice, Beatrice said, buttering toast with the same efficiency she brought to most conversations she found tedious. A woman in your position, Eleanor, cannot afford too much particularity. 2 seasons is not disgraceful, but a third without result begins to look like refusal, and refusal, for a girl with no dowry, is a luxury I am not certain you possess. Eleanor said she understood, because she did, and asked for more tea, because there was nothing else useful to say. She thought, that night, of a fan with a mended rib, and a duke who watched from doorways and never once crossed them, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief arriving early, that hope of that particular kind was not a plan any sensible woman could afford to make, however much some stubborn part of her had already made it anyway. They were introduced properly for the first time that same month, at a musical evening neither had particularly wished to attend, by a mutual acquaintance who had no idea what she was setting in motion. Miss Hartley, may I present His Grace the Duke of Rothmere? Eleanor curtsied. Julian bowed. Neither said the words that would have ended the charade in an instant. We have met, you bandaged my ankle, you called me Mr. Vane and I let you, because a crowded drawing room, both understood without discussing it, was no place to detonate 3 years of careful silence. Miss Hartley, he said instead, his voice steadier than his pulse had any right to be. A pleasure. "Your Grace," she answered, and searched his face for some flicker of the man who'd eaten mutton in her father's kitchen, and found it, unmistakably, in the particular way his jaw tightened, as though holding back considerably more than courtesy required. Neither said another word. He bowed again and moved on, as protocol and his own unbroken contract demanded, and Eleanor spent the remainder of the evening watching him from across the room, certain now beyond any reasonable doubt, and no closer to understanding why certainty had changed absolutely nothing about her circumstances. By her second season, Eleanor had refined the small private rituals that carried her through each evening, the way a sailor carries a compass through fog, trusting it though it points at nothing visible. She arrived early enough to choose her own corner before some kinder stranger's chair could be arranged for her, unwilling to test her composure against that particular mystery twice in 1 week. She counted the dance figures under her breath, still, out of a habit that had stopped being hope and become something closer to discipline. She wrote to her father every Sunday without fail, filling the pages with parish gossip gathered secondhand and small true observations about London's weather, and never once mentioned the blank space at the bottom of each night's dance card, because some silences, she had decided, were kindnesses rather than omissions. And always, in the last quiet minutes before sleep, she opened her mother's fan, not to cool herself, since the London nights rarely required it, but to trace the mended rib with one finger and remind herself that broken things, carefully tended, did not necessarily stay broken forever, whatever the evidence of 3 consecutive seasons might otherwise suggest to a less stubborn woman than herself. There was a night in June when they very nearly spoke as themselves rather than as strangers performing manners. She had stepped onto a terrace at Lady Ashworth's for air, away from the candle heat and the third dance she hadn't been asked to join, and found him already there, alone, looking out over a dark garden as though he had come outside to escape something, not to admire the roses. "Your Grace," she said, startled, already turning to leave, "please." The word came out rougher than he intended, and he softened it at once. "Stay, if you wish. I find I prefer honest silence to the conversation inside." They stood without speaking for nearly a full minute, close enough that she could hear him breathe, and she thought, wildly, that this was surely the moment, that he would say her name the way he'd said it once over bread and weak tea. A footman's voice called him back inside for a promised dance with Miss Fenwick, and Julian's face closed like a door pulled shut against weather. He bowed and left, and Eleanor stood alone on the terrace far longer than the air required, understanding for the first time that whatever bound him, it was not indifference. She told herself, in the weeks that followed, that she had misread the terrace entirely, that a duke bound to marry another woman had simply been polite, that roughness in a voice meant nothing beyond fatigue, that she was, perhaps, exactly the sort of foolish, hopeful girl Aunt Beatrice worried she might become if allowed too much unsupervised imagination. She stopped glancing toward doorways when she entered ballrooms. She stopped tracing the fan's mended rib before sleep. She told herself this was maturity, the same discipline that had carried her through 2 blank-carded seasons, simply applied now to hope itself rather than humiliation. And if the effort of not hoping cost her something the earlier effort never had, she kept that cost as privately as everything else that mattered to her. Louisa, newly married and visiting from Kent that August, remarked that Eleanor seemed rather flat lately, and Eleanor agreed that she supposed she did, and offered no further explanation, because the true one, that she had spent a full year quietly waiting for a man who had never once given her reason to, sounded, even to her own private ear, considerably too foolish to say aloud. Season 2 ended the way Season 1 had, with a final ball, a blank card, and a long carriage ride home, except that this time Beatrice did not wait for Hampshire to deliver her verdict. "One more season," she said, somewhere past Reading, watching the dark fields slide by the carriage window. "I will bring you out once more, Eleanor, because I promised your mother I would see it properly done, and because I am fond of you, whatever you may think. But if nothing comes of a 3rd season, I cannot in good conscience keep presenting an unmarried woman of 21 as though she were still a fresh debutante. There is a limit to what London's patience, or mine, can be expected to extend." Eleanor nodded and looked out her own window, at hedgerows she half recognized from a morning 3 years gone, and did not say what she was thinking, that somewhere in this same county, on this same road, a duke had once thanked her for a kindness he apparently could not now afford to return, and that she had built an entire private hope around the difference between a man's gratitude and a man's courage. The worst of it came earlier that same evening, before the carriage, before Beatrice's careful ultimatum. In a moment Eleanor would have given a great deal to unhear. She had gone toward the card room in search of her uncle, and stopped short of the doorway when she caught her own name inside it, spoken in the lazy, amused drawl of young men who had never once considered that walls carried sound both ways. 10 guineas says Miss Hartley completes a third season without a single dance that isn't charity. A second voice, laughing. 10 says she doesn't even manage that. Old Colonel Whitfield only stood up with her out of pity for the vicar. A third voice, kinder but not kind enough to intervene. Leave off. It isn't sporting. Sporting has nothing to do with it. It's simply fact. Eleanor stood very still in the corridor, one hand flat against the papered wall, and made herself breathe evenly before she turned back the way she'd come, unseen, her uncle unfound, her composure, she would insist to herself later, dressing for bed, entirely intact. It was not intact. Something in her had cracked quietly that night. The way ice cracks under weight, it has borne perfectly well until the one moment it simply cannot anymore. She cried that night, finally, properly, for the first time in 3 seasons, not in the carriage, where Beatrice might notice, but afterward, alone in the narrow bedroom Beatrice's house allotted her, with the door bolted and a pillow pressed hard enough against her face to muffle a sound she had never once, in 21 careful years, allowed anyone to hear. She cried for the wager and for the pity beneath even the kindest voice in that card room, and for every straightened spine and every practiced smile that had. She understood now with unbearable clarity, convinced absolutely no one of anything, except that she could be humiliated quietly and without complaint, which was apparently its own kind of entertainment. She cried too, though she did not fully admit this part even to her pillow, for a duke who watched her from doorways and arranged chairs by fires and sent violets with no card, and had still, after 2 full years, never once done the one thing that would have made any of it matter, never once crossed a room and said, in front of witnesses, that the wager-makers were wrong. By morning her eyes were merely tired, not red, and she went down to breakfast, buttered her toast, and told Beatrice she had slept perfectly well. Julian spent that same recess considerably less peacefully than his correspondence with his mother suggested. Lord Fenwick, growing impatient with 2 years of delicate stalling, had begun pressing for a wedding date with the particular insistence of a man who suspected, correctly, that he was being managed. Cordelia Fenwick herself, to her credit, seemed no more enthusiastic about the arrangement than Julian was, having confided once at a dinner neither of them enjoyed that she harbored an attachment of her own to a naval lieutenant her father considered entirely beneath consideration, a confidence that made Julian, for one strange evening, genuinely fond of her, and considerably more determined to find them both a way out of a bargain neither had chosen. His solicitor's search for an alternative buyer for the mortgaged land had produced 2 false starts and 1 promising lead that collapsed, at the last moment, over a disagreement about drainage rights nobody had anticipated mattering. His mother, meanwhile, grew frailer through that autumn in a way the physicians attributed to age, and Julian privately attributed to years of carrying a household survival on ledgers she thought he did not know. She reviewed by candlelight. He wrote to his solicitor again in November, his patience, like Eleanor's hope, wearing dangerously thin. It was his mother, of all people, who finally told him about the wager, not out of malice, but because she moved in circles where such things traveled fast, and she had grown fond of a girl she had met only twice, and liked considerably more than she liked Cordelia Fenwick's entire family. "They are placing bets on her dignity, Julian," she said, watching her son's face closely. "I do not know what she is to you. I have wondered for 2 years, and you have never told me. But I would ask you to consider, whatever it is, whether you intend to let it remain a secret indefinitely, or whether some things are worth the scandal of hurrying." Julian did not answer her directly. He wrote to his solicitor that same night demanding, in blunt terms his profession rarely permitted, a resolution before the next season began, whatever the cost, however Lord Fenwick's pride might suffer for it. The reply came back cautiously hopeful. A new buyer, a Mr. Ansel Croft, newly wealthy from Manchester manufacturing, had expressed serious interest in the mortgaged land, and terms might, with luck and speed, be settled before spring. Eleanor returned to London for a 3rd season, in a gown she had turned and retrimmed so many times she could no longer remember its original color with any certainty. Though she remembered exactly how many hours the alterations had taken, because she had counted them the way she counted dance figures, out of the same old stubborn discipline. She was 22 now, no longer quite a fresh debutante, however Beatrice chose to present her, and she had stopped pretending, even to herself, that this season carried the easy hope the first one had. It carried something sturdier instead, and considerably more hard-won, a spine straightened not by hope now but by simple habit, a smile deployed not because she expected it to change anything, but because she had decided, somewhere in the 2 years since the wager, that dignity performed without an audience's cooperation was still dignity, and perhaps the only kind truly worth having. She packed her mother's fan as she always did, mended rib and all, though she no longer opened it each night expecting it to mean anything beyond what it had always meant, her mother's hands, once, painting violets for a daughter who would need, decades later, something steady to hold on to through a ballroom's particular cruelty. Beatrice made the terms of the third season explicit within a week of Eleanor's arrival, over the same brisk breakfast tone she reserved for unpleasant necessities. Sir Reginald Pruitt had asked after her a third time, his youngest child now old enough to require, he said, a settled woman's steadying influence, and Beatrice made it plain that a formal understanding with Sir Reginald by autumn would be a satisfactory conclusion to 3 seasons' expense, should nothing more promising present itself first. "I am not scolding you," Beatrice added, watching Eleanor's face carefully. "You have conducted yourself with more grace than most girls manage under considerably less strain. But your father is not young, Eleanor, and a daughter settled, even settled modestly, is a comfort to a man who worries, whatever he does not say in his letters." Eleanor thanked her, meant it, and privately decided that whatever happened this season, she would return to Hampshire afterward regardless, to marry Sir Reginald if it came to that, or simply to keep her father's house if it did not, because 3 years of waiting for a room to be crossed had taught her, finally, not to build her entire life around the crossing. The land sale to Mr. Ansel Croft closed in the first week of March, 3 days before Eleanor's carriage reached London, in a transaction Julian's solicitor described, with visible relief, as considerably smoother than any of us had reason to expect. Lord Fenwick, presented with a sum sufficient to clear the original debt twice over, and an alternative match for Cordelia already quietly arranged with a naval lieutenant now unexpectedly promoted and unexpectedly respectable, proved far less attached to the marriage contract than 3 years of stalling had suggested he might be. "You might have simply asked me sooner whether I wanted it," Cordelia told Julian at their final meeting, with more warmth than either had managed in 2 years of forced civility. "I rather think we both spent a great deal of time being miserable on principle." The formal release was signed on the 12th of March, witnessed by both fathers' solicitors and, at Julian's insistence, by his mother, who read the document twice before setting down her pen and telling her son, with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching a long worry finally resolve itself, that she hoped whoever the girl was, she understood exactly how long a wait she had been worth. Freedom, Julian discovered in the days that followed, was considerably less simple to use than 3 years of wanting it had led him to expect. He could call on Reverend Hartley's daughter properly now, through ordinary channels, and some part of him wanted, badly, to do exactly that, quietly, privately, without the spectacle a public courtship after 3 years of public silence would inevitably invite. But he had watched her stand against walls for 3 seasons while London decided, collectively and without ever once asking her, what she deserved and did not. He had watched wager makers price her dignity at 10 guineas a head. He found, turning a calling card over in his hands one evening, that quiet was no longer the gift he wanted to offer her, however much easier it would be for both of them. The season's final grand ball, hosted that year at Rothmere's own townhouse by old tradition, was 3 weeks away. Every family who had ever looked past Eleanor Hartley would be under his roof that night. He began, carefully, to plan exactly how he intended to spend those 3 weeks, and precisely what he intended to do the moment the doors opened. Eleanor spent the 3 weeks before the season's final ball making a quiet, private peace with an ending she had not chosen, but had by then thoroughly prepared herself to accept. She wrote to her father that she expected to return to Hampshire by summer, one way or another, and meant it kindly rather than bitterly, having decided somewhere in the long, unglamorous work of 3 seasons that a life spent keeping her father's house and teaching parish children their letters was not the tragedy Beatrice seemed to fear it might be, only a different shape of usefulness than the one she had once hoped for. She allowed Sir Reginald Pruitt 2 dances at a smaller gathering in April, and found him perfectly kind, perfectly dull, and perfectly bearable, which she told herself, not unreasonably, was more than many marriages began with. She still carried her mother's fan. She had stopped, mostly, tracing its mended rib each night, though she had not stopped entirely, and on the evening before the final ball, she opened it once more, by candlelight, and allowed herself exactly one indulgent memory of a muddy stranger eating bread in her father's kitchen, before closing it firmly, and telling herself that some doors, having stayed shut 3 years, simply stayed shut. Julian, meanwhile, spent those same 3 weeks arranging details he would have found faintly ridiculous in any other man, and found, in himself, entirely necessary. He confirmed personally that Reverend Hartley's daughter was on Beatrice Price's guest list, and when he discovered Beatrice had nearly declined the invitation, on the grounds that a 4th blank dance card seemed pointless cruelty to inflict on a niece already weary of it, he ensured, through channels sufficiently indirect that Beatrice never suspected his involvement, that the invitation arrived worded in a manner she could not politely refuse. He told his mother everything, finally, one evening in the library over 2 untouched glasses of sherry, the road, the fever, the fan, 3 years of watching from doorways he had told himself were prudence and understood now, fully, had simply been fear wearing Prudence's clothes. His mother listened without interrupting, and when he finished, said only that she had suspected as much for at least 2 years, and that she looked forward, very much, to meeting properly the young woman who had apparently taught her son, without ever intending to, the difference between a debt and a devotion. He did not sleep well in the nights that followed. He did not particularly want to. The morning of the ball, Eleanor pressed her best gown, not new, never new, but carefully kept, and packed her mother's fan into her reticule with hands steadier than she expected. She did not know it was Julian's own house they were traveling to that night. Beatrice, distracted by 100 smaller arrangements, had mentioned only that the ball was at Rothmere House, rather grander than usual this year, and Eleanor had absorbed the detail without particular alarm, having long since stopped expecting any evening, however grand its setting, to unfold differently than the 50 before it. Across London, Julian stood for his valet's final adjustments to a cravat he had already retied twice, aware that he was behaving nothing like the composed man his household believed him to be, and unable, for once, to summon the discipline to care. He had rehearsed nothing. He had decided, deliberately, to rehearse nothing, certain that whatever he managed to say when he finally reached her would matter less than the plain fact of the walking, 40-odd steps across a crowded room, in front of everyone who had ever failed to notice her, taken by a man who never had. The doors of Rothmere House opened at 8, and Eleanor climbed the same kind of candlelit staircase she had climbed some 50 times before, past the same species of curious glances, into a ballroom grander than any she had yet stood against the wall of. She did not recognize at first whose house it was. She was too occupied noting exactly which corner offered the least conspicuous shadow to retreat into once the dancing began. She found her spot. She tied her card to her wrist, blank as ever, ribbon slightly damp from hands that had not stopped being nervous after 3 years of practice not showing it. Across the room, near a small private door usually reserved for the family, Julian watched the crowd arrive with an attention that had nothing to do with hosting and everything to do with a gray gown he would have recognized in complete darkness. The orchestra tuned its instruments. Somewhere beneath the chandeliers, unaware that the man who owned every candle in the room had spent 3 years and considerable fortune arranging to be free enough to cross it, Eleanor Hartley straightened her spine one more time and waited, as she always did, for a season that would very likely end exactly as the last 2 had. An hour passed the way ballroom hours always passed for her, in careful increments of watching rather than participating, in polite refusals of exactly no invitations because none arrived to refuse, in the particular loneliness of being surrounded by 400 people and spoken to by perhaps 6 of them. Louisa, now visibly and fashionably increasing, remarked from across a knot of guests that Rothmere House was rather wasted on a duke who barely attends his own ball, unaware that the duke in question had not left the room in over 40 minutes, occupied instead in a conversation with his mother, considerably shorter on words than on glances toward the far wall. Sir Reginald Pruitt found Eleanor near 10 o'clock, kind as always, and asked, hopefully, whether she might do him the honor of the next dance. She agreed, because he deserved better than a refusal built on hope she had promised herself she'd stopped indulging, and because one dance, however dutiful, was one more than most of the evening had offered her. She was retying her glove when the orchestra finished that set, unaware that across the room, a duke who had waited 3 years for precisely this moment had just told his mother, quietly, that it was time. He did not send a footman to fetch her, and he did not wait for an introduction he no longer required. He simply walked, straight across the full width of Rothmere House's ballroom, past his own startled guests, past a card table that fell silent mid-hand, past Louisa's frozen half-sentence and Beatrice's teacup pausing an inch from her lips, past every family who had spent 3 seasons deciding, without ever asking her opinion on the matter, exactly how little attention Eleanor Hartley was worth. The orchestra, sensing something before it entirely understood what, softened without quite stopping. Conversation guttered out in a wave that followed him across the floor the way silence follows weather, room by room, until by the time he reached the room's center, every soul present had turned to watch a duke who never danced walk the entire length of his own ballroom with an expression none of them had ever seen him wear, not the cold correctness London had decided defined him, but something unguarded and helplessly hopeful. Eleanor, glove half fastened, looked up at the sudden hush and found herself, for one disorienting moment, entirely unable to understand what 400 people were staring at, until she realized they were staring past her, and then, impossibly, at her. He stopped in front of her with far less composure than 3 years of ducal restraint should have permitted, and for one full breath said nothing at all, simply looked at her the way he had looked at her once from a doorway a lifetime of seasons ago. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, and then, quieter, only for her, "Eleanor. I believe I once told you my name was vain, and let you believe it was the whole of it, because I was a coward with a title I hadn't yet decided how to carry. I am considerably less of a coward now, though it took me embarrassingly long to manage it." Somewhere behind her, she heard Beatrice's teacup meet its saucer with a small, unmistakable clatter. "I have crossed this entire room, in front of everyone who has ever watched you stand against a wall and decided you weren't worth approaching," Julian went on, "to ask you, properly, by my whole and honest name, for the honor of this dance." Eleanor's hand, still holding her mended fan, was not entirely steady as she offered it. "You have made me wait 3 years, Your Grace," she said, her voice coming out amused rather than angry. "I do hope you dance better than you apologize." He danced considerably better than he apologized, as it turned out, guiding her into the set with the unhurried confidence of a man who had imagined this for 3 years and refused to rush it. The room, still faintly stunned, resumed its music and its motion around them, though every eye in Rothmere House found its way back to the pair at the center of the floor more often than strict etiquette required. Louisa watched with an expression caught somewhere between astonishment and the beginning of a story she would tell at dinner parties for the rest of her married life. Beatrice watched with something closer to tears, having wanted better for her niece than 3 blank seasons and never known how to arrange it herself. "The fan," Julian said quietly, midway through the second figure, nodding at the small ivory shape still looped to her wrist even mid-dance. "You kept it. You sent violets to match it," Eleanor said, "and had a roof mended you thought I'd never trace back to you, and arranged a chair by a fire I sat in for a full season before I let myself believe it meant anything. Did you imagine, Your Grace, that a woman raised by a country parson wouldn't eventually add the sums correctly?" When the set ended, he did not release her hand, and led her instead, with Beatrice's visibly delighted permission, to a quieter alcove near the library doors, where he told her everything in plainer terms than a crowded ballroom had allowed: his father's debt, the contract, Cordelia's own reluctant unhappiness, the drainage rights that had cost him months he still resented, his mother's illness, and her final push toward honesty. "I told myself, more than once, that watching from a distance and arranging small kindnesses was a kind of love a bound man could honestly offer," he said. "I understand now, it was mostly cowardice, dressed respectably. You deserved a man willing to risk scandal for you a great deal sooner than I managed to become one." Eleanor considered this, turning her mother's fan slowly in her gloved hands. "You are not entirely wrong," she said, "but I have spent 3 seasons learning that waiting, endured with a straight spine, is not the same as waiting wasted. I would rather have 3 years of a man building toward courage, honestly, than 1 season of a man who never had to try. I find, Your Grace, that I am not nearly so interested in your apology as I am in what you intend to do next." What he intended to do next, he told her, was call on her father in Hampshire within the fortnight, properly, with a ring his mother had clearly kept far longer than modest, and after that, should Reverend Hartley approve, which neither doubted, to marry her in the same county church where a muddy stranger had once eaten bread at her family's table and never quite left her thoughts again. Reverend Hartley, when the fortnight came, wept rather more than a country parson generally admitted to, and gave his blessing before Julian had entirely finished asking for it. Louisa sent a letter of congratulations so warm it startled everyone who received it, having decided that being cousin to a duchess suited her better than her earlier assessment of Eleanor had allowed. Beatrice, at the wedding, cried openly and without apology, and told anyone who would listen that she had always known her niece was destined for something grander, a claim no one believed but everyone, out of affection, let her keep. Eleanor carried her mother's mended fan to her wedding, violets faded but unmistakable, and opened it once, briefly, on the church steps, fanning herself against a warmth that had, for the first time in 3 long seasons, nothing to do with enduring anything at all.